General, thank you for your time. Let's start with this. What is the latest updates?
Well, we've made a lot of progress over the last several weeks, and we working in support of both FEMA and the Commonwealth have progressed to the point where I'd say we're moving out of the emergency response and in towards a stabilization phase, which is really all about recovery. As far as troops go, last time you and I talked, I kind of give you a lay down. Right now we have just over 13,000 troops and 59 aircraft here from the military still. Those numbers will draw down over in the coming weeks as we complete our missions in support of FEMA.
So let's talk about moving into the recovery phase rather than the emergency. What gives you that impression that things are progressing that way?
Well, virtually all roads have been cleared. So all of our roads to the regional staging areas, all of our roads to the points of distribution, all major routes have been cleared, most secondary roads throughout Puerto Rico. There are some roads that are damaged that will need to be rebuilt, but the bottom line is we can move supplies all over the island on the ground. And so given that, we've been moving a significant number of supplies to every single municipality, and some municipalities are asking us to back off a little bit. And part of it, the reason for that is, if you think about it, we're trying to help the island recover. But if part of that recovery, of course, is an economic recovery, and when you have grocery stores that are open and fully stocked, and they are in some municipalities, not in all, but grocery stores fully open and fully stocked, and the people have access to what is essentially a food stamp program. It's called PAN locally. If that system is in place, and we keep delivering food for free, then we get in the way of that economic recovery, because then we're in competition with the grocery store. So we're trying to balance it location by location to make sure that we get the right balance. But it's a sign, for example, that we're moving towards recovery and out of emergency response.
How many military members are under your command there currently, sir?
Well, it's about 9,000. There's 13,000 total, but that includes about 4,000 or a little bit more than 4,000 from the National Guard. Brigadier General Reyes is our dual status commander. He is under my command, but the National Guard troops that are serving here from Puerto Rico and other states are under his command, but I don't have direct authority over them. They work under a state authority rather than a federal authority.
What is the number of troops that you expect to scale down to?
Well, on the federal side, eventually we will go to zero. We have troops here. The way the system works is we bring in a team with FEMA for any emergency, and in fact our team is called a defense coordinating element. They got here on the 4th of September with their FEMA teammates, and then they pull us forward based on those requirements. And so we're only here to do that work. And when that work is complete, we'll go to zero. Now, the Guard troops and the United States Army Reserve troops that are here based in Puerto Rico, some of those will stay on active duty through much of the recovery period.
Right, and I understand that, but with the 13,000 you have, do you expect to go from 13, or let's say the 9,000 under your command, do you expect to go from that to zero, or will you scale down?
I think we'll eventually go to, it'll go down probably the last federal troops that'll be on active duty here in Puerto Rico will be our United States Army Reserve soldiers that are mobilized for the hurricane response. Right now we have about 2,500 of those. Those numbers will shrink eventually as well, but the last military forces that'll be on active duty here will be National Guard troops.
But your federal troops, would you expect to scale down to zero immediately, or would you stagger?
No. This is going to be over weeks and weeks. And as far as the Army Reserve, we will have some of them remain on active duty. For example, they have some signal units that are taking over from our active component, our active duty signal units. They'll probably stay on active duty for several months.
What are some of the highlights that you gave to the governor? It's my understanding you briefed him, I think, 36 hours ago. Can you share with us some of that briefing?
Sure. We discussed a couple of things. First of all, costs. And we got a refined estimate on costs. And I had laid these costs out for him earlier, probably 2 weeks into our emergency response. And now, after we've been operating, we've got refined costs. And the reason this is important is because, generally speaking, we in the military tend to be very expensive. If you look at our helicopters and what it costs to bring our helicopters here and to operate them, it's more expensive than what FEMA eventually uses, which is civilian contracts. Of course, what we give is a lot of agility. We give an ability to respond in a hurry, and we give a lot of agility, and we can mass troops and equipment on particular problems. But over time, the big idea is that FEMA wants to move to contracts because it's cheaper, and it's more efficient than use of the military forces. And sometimes, especially when those contracts are local, we can put that money back into the local economy to help with the recovery. So I gave him refined estimates. These are just estimates, but I gave him refined estimates of costs for both what we're providing for aviation and military medical support. Really, our three major hospitals that we have, with the Air Force Hospital in Awadilla, the Army Hospital at Humacao, and the U.S. Navy ship Comfort. And the costs, now that we've been operating, are cheaper than initially estimated. This is important because even though the governor isn't writing the checks, obviously all American citizens are, but if FEMA's, it helps FEMA get a better estimate of what they have to spend on us to cover what we're doing. So that's one thing I told him.
Well, let me just pause you there to ask a follow-up question. What are those estimated costs?
Well, they're in the tune of, for each of those military hospitals, they're between $5 and $8 million per month operating costs.
And what about those military helicopters?
That was a lot lower than we initially estimated, because our initial costs ranged from 30 to 75 million a month.
Why was it lower?
Well, I'm not an accountant. I don't know the details of why but after operating, we figured out it was going to be a lot. After we had been in operation, it was cheaper. Now, the initial cost I know was expensive because we moved a lot of those hospitals. The exception is the ship, but we moved a lot of those hospitals by air. So the example is our 14th Combat Support Hospital in Humacao. That took 17 C-17s to fly it here. And so and that's not how we'll redeploy it, by the way. When we're done operating and the conditions are right in the local area and the local hospital is up and running, and we can collapse that hospital, we'll send it back by sea lift because overall it's a lot cheaper. It takes a little while longer, but it's a lot cheaper to move that way. The second thing that the governor and I discussed, he asked a question about, I had made some recommendations which are not yet approved on redeployment of some of our capability, and he had asked me a question about what we were going to have left after that redeployment for engineer capability. This is important for route clearance. Even though the roads are clear, we want to retain some ability to respond to emergencies. As you know, that when it rains here in the mountains with little ground cover that's been, kind of wiped away by the hurricane, those mountainsides are far more vulnerable to landslides. So we want to have some capability to respond to emergency route clearance. And he had asked me earlier some details on that. I gave him a ballpark, but then what I did is give him a refined structure. And so essentially what we have is across the island we have 30 10-person teams. Each of them has a dozer of a sort and a large truck, plus a smaller vehicle like a Humvee, a number of chainsaws. And these teams are all they're spread throughout the island in a regional, organized into 4 regional task forces, so that we can respond to emergency requests for route clearance.
What are some of the highlights, General, that you've learned that you would never want to see done again in a disaster such as this? General, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I'm trying not to give you just a snappy answer. I don't know off the top of my head of anything that we would not try again. We have learned through operations that some things did not work as initially intended. We had a good plan, but once we tried it out, we figured out that there was a lack of capability, or our assumption had proved false. And then based on that, we shifted our effort and changed midstream. So we changed how we did business and went about it a different way and got a more effective result. But I haven't seen anything that I thought was a really bad idea from the start, that would not be a logical reason to move forward. So, as an example, we operated here initially in concert with the Puerto Rican Army National Guard. We came in with the same baseline assumptions as we had with the Texas Army National Guard, but they had far less resources here. So, we made some decisions in the beginning that we ended up having to shift effort. And the example was how low do we use our federal forces to move supplies? Because our initial position was we were just going to move the supplies to the staging areas, and then the guard forces were going to take over from there. And what we found is that they needed a lot more help. And so we shifted our effort, and we ended up working at a much lower level on the federal side. But that doesn't mean that our initial, that I would not try our initial approach again, because I think it was valid. It's just that, sometimes when you're in the middle of an emergency, you try something and you figure out the conditions are not what you thought they were, so you have to shift your effort.
What was something that you came in and decided to do that worked really well?
I think the example from my perspective was our use of our helicopters. We came in and we have not gotten, the way the system is designed is we're supposed to use all of our resources based on requests, and those requests can come from local mayors, they can come from the Commonwealth, but generally speaking, we're here to support FEMA. And so what we should do is we take FEMA's requests, and if they're delivering X amount of certain types of supplies in a given municipality like Utuado or Hayuya, somewhere in the mountains, then we would use our helicopters to meet that requirement. But we came in and made a decision up front that we were not going to hold anything back. And so I said, look, everything that we can fly every day, I want you to load up all the food and water. And early on, we had gasoline and diesel as part of that mix, but then, the system recovered pretty quickly there. But load up everything we can on all the helicopters and just push it. Push it to where we think there's need. And I want you, every time you're flying, to look for places that you think need help and just push them supplies. We're not going to wait on any requests. Now, the result of that is, right now, as of today, we have 196 flight hours available with all the aircraft we have here. We have 196 flight hours available every day. And we're filling about 25 to 30 hours of requirements a day. So we have far more aircraft than we've actually been requested. Initially, in the emergency response, I think it was fine to push all that stuff forward. But now, again, as I said, we're starting to reach the point where we actually got saturation of supplies, both food and water, in some of the municipalities. And so we've got to meter that and balance it and have a tailored approach for each one. So, soon, we haven't stopped pushing supplies, but we'll shift from that and really go to a more directed approach under FEMA's guidance.
In your opinion, what as of today remains one of the most vulnerable areas of the island?
You mean geographically or functionally?
In terms of needing the resources of your federal troops.
I think the areas through the mountains. So kind of in Las Maria to the west over to Caguas, and maybe even down as far southeast as Yabucoa, where the storm came ashore. But that area in the mountains is the most vulnerable. And like I said, the roads are clear. We're able to drive supplies in, but if there are big storms, we're going to have more landslides, and more landslides will lead to places being cut off. But they're also vulnerable because those are the places that are probably going to be most challenged when it comes to infrastructure, in particular restoring water and electricity. And of course, much of the water flow depends on electricity, whether it's on the grid, which is ideal, or if it's not on the grid, at least through primary and secondary generators. So I think geographically, those areas are the most vulnerable. But I also alluded to functionally. I think that the biggest overarching problem for the recovery that is going to affect everything is the electrical grid, because it affects the stability of what goes on in every hospital. If we have hospitals, most hospitals are now on the grid, which is good news. But we've set up so we have at least a fully functional backup generator at all of those. And those that are on generator power have backup generators. And that's my biggest concern over time is really restoration of the electrical grid. Because until we get it back, it's going to affect economic recovery. It'll continue to shape it.
How have federal troops been involved in electricity restoration?
We have been using our federal troops, to do some maintenance on generators. We have some, a small number, but we do have some generator mechanics. And so even from the start of the storm response, we had some Marines and Seabees ashore that had come in right behind the storm, and they started work right away trying to help local hospitals and restore generator power. In fact, there's a major air traffic control tower in Yunque, which is the rainforest on the northeast side of the island, and Marines cleared the route up to it and then restored that, got that generator up and running, which was really important to get the airport system back online so that they could have positive control of aircraft. So we've been doing things with maintaining generators, and we've helped clear obstacles. The biggest thing that we've done is probably clear roads, whether it's using dozers to plow away landslides or chainsaws to cut trees and move them out of the way, to set the groundwork for the electrical crews who will come in and help restore the grid. Now, we do have a small number of military troops who are linemen, who are here under the 249th Engineer Battalion. They're not working for me. They're working for the Corps of Engineers, which is working directly for FEMA. They're more directly involved in restoring the electrical grid by putting up poles and restringing line and those kinds of things.
Finish this statement for me. Hurricane Maria has taught me.
Wow. Well, it has taught me a lot of things, and I was actually, I taught a class by VTC earlier this week to, each of our joint services runs a series of courses for general officers, flag officers, on that's focused on solving problems at a operational and strategic level. There's a Joint Flag Officer warfighting course, and I mean, as recently, I've been a general officer for 10 years now. As recently as this spring, I went to another course. So we maintain these professional development opportunities throughout our career. And so I taught a 45-minute class to a group of officers, mostly from the U.S., but it also included one each Canadian, British officer, and Australian earlier this week. And I was talking to them about being a Joint Force Land Component commander. And I had a series of, I think, nine different points. And the very first point, and which I think is really probably the most important, is to define the problem. So we come, our military spends a lot of time and effort on professional development, and we learn throughout our career what we call the military decision-making process, which is how do we take a situation and figure out how to solve it? How do we solve a problem? And it's, it's pretty prescriptive, and the process is very logical in developing alternate courses of action and comparing them and eventually ending up with the best solution. But here's the problem with that. Most often, that starts with the idea that you know what the problem is. And so at this level, you're not going to get detailed guidance that says, here are the 10 tasks that I want you to achieve. You'll get guidance like, stop the dying or things like that. I mean, it's very broad and very general. So if you want to be effective, you can't just have your staff get busy solving problems. First thing you have to figure out is what's the core problem that you're trying to solve. And so for me, when I came here, the way after reading the tea leaves for a couple of days, I really believed that Puerto Rico was absolutely overwhelmed, and it was overwhelmed for a couple of reasons. First of all, the island itself was vulnerable. The infrastructure was vulnerable. I know you've read a lot about that with the power grid and things like that, but the location was vulnerable. Secondly, there wasn't much capacity here to deal with it. So, again, having most recently dealt with both Texas and Florida with a lot of capacity and a lot of capacity in neighboring states, Puerto Rico, of course, was isolated because it was an island commonwealth, and they didn't have a lot of capacity internally in the first place. And then the third thing is that the storm completely devastated this place, and there was no part of Puerto Rico that wasn't devastated and wasn't impacted. And those three things added up to a situation where the Commonwealth was overwhelmed. So how we did business here was very different than how we normally do business and how we did it in Texas or Florida, where we are just, kind of behind the scenes providing additional support to the state and emergency management agency and FEMA. We had a far more direct role here. But it was helpful to think through that in the first place so that we didn't make bad assumptions from the start.
In hindsight, were federal resources too slow to arrive?
I don't think so. In the ideal situation, the storm wouldn't have closed all the ports. But so it did. Yeah, I mean, you can't just magic that away. And again, you can't drive down a highway and get here. And in fact, federal forces were on the ground here as the storm left, because we had three ships, the Oak Hill, the Wasp, and the USS Kearsarge. They were all working in support of U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as a result of Hurricane Irma. And when the storm Maria started approaching, they got out of the way of the storm and came back in on the tail side of it and began search and rescue operations, within a matter of hours. So they were not slow to arrive. In fact, we had, upwards of 3,000 troops here doing all kinds of search and rescue operations. But as far as the rest of the forces, like myself, all the land-based stuff, the extra helicopters, the hospitals, was it slow to arrive? Well, I guess you can say it was slow to arrive, but you can't magic away the fact that if you don't have an open airport or an open seaport, you can't just transport yourself there. You actually have to open that stuff first, which is what caused a delay.
There seemed, based on my reporting, General, to be so many people who could have made tough decisions to help, but either because the communication was cut out or people didn't know, or for whatever reason, communication seemed to impede progress at every level since day one. Do you agree with that?
I think that if you live on a mountaintop in Hyuya and you are cut off from communications, and the mayor that is actually responsible for the emergency response throughout his municipality doesn't know that you're cut off and doesn't know what your situation is, well, sure, getting effective response is going to be a lot harder, which kind of led to my decision to just start pushing supplies, whether they were asked for or not, because I had a sense that that we needed help everywhere. And so I think that, for the first week or so that I was here, we really didn't have through the system, through the mayors and, going up through the Commonwealth and to FEMA, we didn't have a great feel for where all the problems were. As we discovered problems, we would record it and either solve them or take good note of it. If you have a bridge that was washed out, we wouldn't be able to necessarily solve it, but we'd make sure that everybody knew that bridge was washed out so that we could find alternate routes. But if we had trees down across the road and we could solve it with chainsaws and move them out of the way and clear it so that we could get even a small car through, we would take care of that. But I think the lack of communications at the tactical level, so down at the village level, down at below the municipality, impacted everybody's understanding of where their real needs were. We never had a breakdown in communications at the national level. From me back to my higher command, U.S. Northern Command and Peterson Air Force Base, and you think about it, we bring in our own communication system that's satellite-based and everything, so we're not dependent on the infrastructure. We never had problems talking to our own troops, whether it was helicopters, guys, medics, those kinds of things. But just knowing what was going on in the middle of some, small, remote mountaintop village was certainly an issue from the beginning.
What's the ballpark estimate as to how much the military has spent in Puerto Rico so far?
Oh, I don't know, but I can get an answer for you. I'm going to have to reach back to my resource manager at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. I can tell you that because we're also responsible for operations in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and frankly, we're almost done there on the military side. So I got an initial estimate from our defense coordinating officer there. It was $141 million for the U.S. Virgin Islands, and that was so far. But that was an estimate that's refined. It's far more than that in Puerto Rico.
If you'll allow me to ask a couple of questions about the Virgin Islands, what is the latest that's happening there?
Well, they've still got a crippling situation when it comes to electricity. One island, I think it's St. Thomas, I may be wrong here, was up around 30% electrical power restored, but the other two, St. John and St. Croix, are down around 15% or so. So they've got a problem there. As far as the military goes, we've got two mobile hospitals there. They're much smaller than the ones we have on Puerto Rico. It's called an Area Support Medical Company. Both of those will be wrapping up operations in the next week. So as the hospital system, gains more stability there. So, the situation is again overall pretty vulnerable, but as far as the military's response, we're almost done in the Virgin Islands.
You were incident commander in Texas after Hurricane Harvey, Florida after Irma, and now Puerto Rico after Maria. When was the last time you went home, General?
Well, I was home in September briefly, and remember, even when I was, it's actually not. So I'm gonna. When we use terminology, we try to be specific. The incident commander, believe it or not, in our incident command system, which is agreed on by every emergency department throughout the country, is usually that local commander. Sometimes a fire chief or something like that. But I was the Joint Force Land Component Commander, so not overall in charge. You know, the guy who's usually in charge is that local person. You know, it might have been the Houston, fire department or something like that. But for Harvey, we operated out of our headquarters because our headquarters is Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. So we were able to operate out of there with, and it worked well. So I was home in early September, and no issues from that.
Last question. What is one thing you will take away from Harvey, Irma, and Maria?
Well, this is another one of those, those things that I provided to all of those future Joint Force Land Component Commanders in my class earlier this week. And I think that, from a military perspective, a lot of times we're taught early on that one of the most important things to achieve, in fact, it's, in our doctrine, we get this when we're an ROTC cadet. We learn that one of the principles of war is unity of command. But I really believe what's far more important, especially in a situation like this, is not unity of command, it's unity of effort. What we've got to do is work together as a team, focused on a common purpose. And then we can figure out how can we work together to achieve that purpose. And, and frankly, the state emergency manager in Texas or Florida or here in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, they don't have directive authority over my troops. But if we're determined, if we're determined to work together as a team to solve common problems, we're actually going to be a lot more effective in solving those than if we're trying to spend a lot of time and energy on who's in charge of what. And so that's been a mantra for us throughout, which is figure out what needs to be done and be helpful. Come in with an attitude of humility and try to help people who need help. So, it hasn't changed. I came into this job believing that unity of effort was absolutely critical, and that's what I tried to preach throughout the command, so that everybody has that same attitude, so that we can be helpful, rather than spending energy on things that we just don't need to.
What haven't I asked that you'd like to add?
I think here's something that many people in your audience may not have a handle for or have an understanding of, but everywhere I go, first of all, I've talked to you in the past about just how great it is to see Puerto Ricans chipping in and making a difference and how they're taking care of their neighbors. But the other thing that we see a lot of are volunteer organizations from sometimes around the world, but dominantly from the United States, that are just here to try to make a difference, solving problems. And I run into these guys in remote areas. They're just out there to try to help, and their help is absolutely welcomed and absolutely needed. And so from me, who's frankly, I have a salary. I'm getting paid to do this. Most of these people are not. They're here of their own free will, and so I just wanted to say thanks to them.
General, thank you for your time.
All right, thanks.